The nurse had kind eyes. She looked at him the way people look at someone recovering from something terrible, and her voice stayed careful and soft as she explained what had happened to his house. It was a museum now. His car, the black imported one he'd bought with his first signing bonus and barely driven, had been auctioned off in 2018. The fund holding 12 years of accumulated pay had been liquidated and donated to national disaster relief. His phone number no longer existed. His apartment lease had been terminated. His license had expired. Somman Yaop sat up slowly in the hospital bed, machines still attached to his wrist, and took in the room around him. The walls were too white. The window showed a skyline he didn't quite recognize. Taller buildings, different angles, a highway overpass that hadn't been there before. He'd been gone a long time. He was 36 years old and had nothing. Here was the part no one in this bright modern hospital was going to put in a pamphlet. 17 years before this morning, he had saved the world. Not in a small way, not in a quiet, behind-the-scenes kind of way. The dungeons had come in 2005. Rifts tearing open across every continent, spilling monsters into subway stations and shopping districts and schoolyards. Humanity lost the first 2 years badly. Cities fell. Entire regions were quarantined. Then the Esports appeared. People who developed abilities, physical enhancements that turned ordinary men and women into fighters. And the tide turned, slowly, painfully. Governments set up hunter associations, combat academies, ranking systems. The best fighters cleared the lower dungeons, the middle ones, the ones that took lives in batches. And then there was the final dungeon. Nobody wanted to talk about what the final dungeon was actually like. The reports that came out of it were short and clinical. What it contained at its deepest levels, the things that lived down there, was the kind of information that got locked in classified vaults. What mattered publicly was this. In 2004, the final dungeon opened, and everyone who entered it died. Every attempt, every nationally assembled team, dead. In 2005, Somman Yaop went in with 6 others. They called themselves the 7 Heroes. Though Yaop himself had rolled his eyes at the name, they were not heroes. They were 7 people who were very good at not dying. 5 years in, 5 of them came out alive. 2 didn't. Yaop stayed. He hadn't planned to stay alone. The dungeon didn't end where they expected, and someone had to push through the final level, and by then it was just him. So he stayed. A year became 2. 2 became 5. By year 9, he had stopped marking the days and started marking other things. Kill counts, floor depths, the exact weight distribution needed to throw a spear through 3 overlapping targets at a 40-degree angle. The dungeon was his entire world, and he was very good at surviving it. 17 years. He cleared it in 2021 by the Earth calendar, time moving differently at those depths, and he stepped out of a closing rift near his own memorial statue in the middle of Seoul and collapsed on the pavement. There was a plaque on the base of the statue. He hadn't been able to read it clearly before he passed out. Now, in this hospital room, the nurse was still explaining things. She mentioned compensation procedures and government liaison offices and the association's back pay calculations, and Yaop let the words move past him like water. He was trying to figure out where he was going to sleep tonight. This was the world he'd bought with 17 years of his life, peaceful, functional, and completely indifferent to what it had cost him. He had one visitor before the end of that first day. The door opened without a knock, and a man walked in. Older than Yaop remembered, gray at the temples now, wearing a tracksuit that probably cost more than it looked like. He stopped in the doorway and looked at Yaop for a long moment without speaking. His jaw worked once, like he was trying to find the first word and couldn't locate it. Then Jiho started crying. Not quietly. He sat in the chair beside the bed and put his hands over his face and made the particular sound of a man who had spent a long time holding something down and had finally run out of places to store it. Yaop watched him without moving. He wasn't sure what to say. He'd never been particularly good with that kind of moment, even before 17 years of solitary combat had removed most of his social instincts. After a while, Jiho pulled his hands down and looked at him with red eyes and said, carefully, quietly, that he had thought Yaop was dead. He'd thought it for 14 years. They all had. Yaop said he hadn't died. Jiho said he knew that now. A pause filled the space between them. Then Jiho started talking about the association, about pension payments owed, about legal procedures for the return of a declared missing Esper, and Yaop understood that Jiho was the same as he'd always been. Emotional first, then immediately practical, filling silence with logistics when feelings became too large to hold. Some people were like that. It was one of the reasons Yaop had trusted him. Out of everything he'd lost in 17 years, Jiho was not one of them, and that was worth something. The association moved quickly once they confirmed his identity. Physical tests, blood samples, a biometric scan that took 3 hours, and made 2 technicians visibly uncomfortable when the results came back. Yaop's body hadn't aged. His physical statistics were, as one researcher put it with scientific precision and visible distress, incompatible with their measurement scale. His aura reading, aura being the energy that powered Esper abilities, measured on a scale that theoretically maxed at 100, came back at 1020. The machines ran it 3 times. The technician printed the result and held the paper with both hands and said nothing. Yaop didn't think this was particularly remarkable. He'd stopped tracking his own numbers around year 7. Numbers hadn't mattered in the dungeon. What mattered was whether the thing trying to kill you was dead yet. There was another number the association didn't know about, and he saw no reason to mention it. His mentality stat, the mental fortitude score that governed focus under pressure, tactical processing, and resistance to fear, had broken past the human limit of 100 somewhere around year 11 and sat at 110. Nobody was supposed to be able to do that. What it had given him, in practical terms, was something he thought of privately as amplification, the ability to push any skill or attribute beyond its normal ceiling, like cracking open a valve that was never meant to be turned that far. He hadn't needed it yet. Jiho drove him to a rental apartment that smelled like fresh paint and had a television larger than any Yaop had ever owned, and Yaop spent the first 3 evenings watching every drama and film released after 2005 that he could access on a streaming platform. He had missed 16 years of television. That, more than anything else about his situation, struck him as genuinely unfair. The media found out he was back on the 4th day. The story broke through an association official who couldn't keep quiet, and by morning every major sports network had a camera truck outside the building. Yaop stood at the window, looked at the crowd below, and spent a few seconds calculating the fastest route to the nearest back exit. Jiho convinced him to do 1 press conference. Controlled, 2 hours maximum, then done. It lasted 40 minutes before Yaop stopped answering questions. He didn't walk out. He simply stopped responding, mid-session, and sat at the table with his hands folded while a reporter asked him to confirm whether the 7 heroes' records were, and the reporter quoted an editorial here, inflated legacy claims from an era without reliable verification systems. Yaop looked at the reporter. He kept looking at him for long enough that the man shifted in his seat and lost his professional stillness. The room went quiet. Then Yaop turned to the next question. Later, a clip of that silence got cut with some music underneath it and collected a significant number of views, and people who watched it couldn't fully explain why it made them uncomfortable. But they remembered it. The reporters, though, were just noise. The real problem was a man named Gerald Walker. Walker was American. He played Tanker, the defensive specialist role in VR Battlefield, the esport that had grown up around dungeon combat the way basketball had grown up around empty lots and rubber balls. He was 28, built like a piece of construction equipment, and had been the top-ranked tanker in the world for 3 consecutive years. He appeared on a Korean broadcast 2 days after the press conference and explained, in the tone of someone doing a public service, that the 7 heroes were historical figures the same way ancient Olympic runners were historical figures. Impressive for their time, irrelevant by modern standards, and not meaningfully comparable to current professionals who trained in structured programs with objective performance metrics. Whatever Somman Yaop had done in that dungeon for 17 years had no bearing on competitive rankings today, and treating him as some kind of returning legend was, Walker said with a polished smile, a little embarrassing for everyone involved. Jiho, sitting beside Yaop on his couch, had the careful stillness of a man waiting for an explosion that might not come. Yaop finished the crackers he'd been eating and set the bag down. He asked Jiho if the association studio had a VR testing module available. Jiho said yes. Yaop asked if something could be arranged. Jiho said, slowly, that he supposed it could. The thing about Gerald Walker, the thing that was already visible to anyone looking at him correctly, though no one was looking at him correctly, was that his technique had a gap. Yaop had identified it in 30 seconds of broadcast footage. Walker held his shield at full extension, maximizing frontal coverage, which meant his lower legs were always exposed on the diagonal, and his reaction to attacks coming from that angle ran roughly 0.4 of a second slower than his overall profile suggested. It wasn't an obvious flaw. It wouldn't be obvious to someone who hadn't spent 17 years reading creatures that could strike from 12 directions at once. Walker didn't know this about himself. His coaches apparently didn't know. The entire professional commentary apparatus that praised his form in weekly breakdowns didn't know. Yaop knew. He said nothing about it. He just asked for the module. The broadcast arrangement went through the association faster than it should have, which confirmed for Yaop that someone upstream was interested in the commercial value of this matchup. He didn't particularly mind. He arrived at the studio in clothes Jiho had bought him and walked past a row of camera operators and analysts who tracked him with the focused attention of people expecting either a great story or a spectacular failure. Walker was already in the preparation zone. He was larger in person than he appeared on broadcasts. He acknowledged Yaop with the careful courtesy of a man who had already decided how the next hour would end and was simply moving through the formalities. Yaop picked up a training spear from the rack by the entry point, turned it over once, checked its weight, set it down, and selected a different one. A technician asked if he wanted to review the module parameters. Yaop said he was fine. The technician asked if he'd like to familiarize himself with the current VR control interface, since the system had evolved considerably since 2004. Yaop said he was fine. Walker watched this exchange with a small, private expression. The rules were standard for an exhibition. Esper abilities permitted, lethal level attacks flagged and nullified. First to 3 eliminations wins. Yaop made one modification request. He asked that his immortality ability be locked out for the duration of the match. Walker's expression didn't change, but his coach, standing behind him, glanced up from his tablet. Yaop said he thought it was fairer that way. Walker said, after a brief pause, that it was Yaop's choice. They entered the module. What happened inside lasted under 4 minutes, and those 4 minutes generated more analytical content over the following week than most championship finals. Walker opened with exactly what Yaop expected, a high-coverage defensive advance, shield at full extension, pushing control of the center, and forcing Yaop toward the perimeter. It was technically excellent. Everything Walker did was technically excellent. His footwork was cleaner than almost anyone Yaop had studied since coming back, and his forward pressure was the kind that made lesser opponents panic and commit errors. The problem was that it was designed to handle opponents who played within the boundaries of tactical reason. Yaop had not operated within those boundaries for 17 years. He let Walker drive the advance for 30 seconds, mapping the pattern, and then moved, not back, not to the perimeter, but forward and low, dropping inside the shield's effective angle, hitting precisely the diagonal Walker's lower legs were exposed on, and the attack landed before Walker's reaction cycle completed. Walker reset and reassessed. Fast. A lesser fighter would have doubled down on the same approach. Walker adapted. He adapted to the wrong thing. Yaop let him. The second elimination came off a spear throw along a line Walker had now shifted his defensive alignment to cover, except Yaop had already abandoned that line, using the weapon's return arc in a way that wasn't possible with standard technique. The third was slower, more deliberate. Walker was genuinely working by then, his footwork sharp, his reads improving in real time, and Yaop gave him space to demonstrate that. Let the analysts watching the feed start to believe Walker was stabilizing. Then he removed the space entirely. 3 eliminations, under 4 minutes. Walker stood in the scoring zone for a moment before setting his shield down on the floor. He asked, quietly, directly, outside the camera angles, how Yaop had read the diagonal. Yaop told him. He laid out the mechanics of Walker's defensive stance, where the gap existed, why the physics of it created the exposure, and what the correction would require at the footwork level. He spoke for about 90 seconds. Walker listened without interrupting. At the end, Walker asked if Yaop would consult further. Yaop said he would send him a rate. The match clip went everywhere. Analysts who'd spent the previous week explaining why the 7 heroes were historically significant, but no longer relevant, ran correction segments the following morning. Yaop watched one of these segments while eating breakfast and felt nothing about it in particular. He changed the channel to a drama series from 2011 that he still needed to finish. Jiho called while the drama was running and asked if Yaop would come to the national training facility and look at the team. There was a Korea versus USA international match coming up. The coaching staff had roster problems they weren't solving, and Jiho, who was the national head coach now, which Yaop had processed with genuine surprise, thought a second perspective might be useful. Yaop said he'd come tomorrow. Jiho said the match was in 6 days. Yaop said tomorrow was fine. He had 2 episodes left. The national facility was large, clean, and equipped with infrastructure that would have been unimaginable in 2004. Rows of VR combat modules, multi-angle replay rooms, a medical wing, a nutritional unit, a separate strategic planning section with 3 whiteboards and a server rack. Yaop walked through it with his hands in his pockets, and Jiho walked beside him with the particular expression of a man who trusts someone completely and is also slightly nervous about what that someone is going to say. The national team players tracked Yaop's arrival with varying degrees of skepticism. A few he recognized by reputation. Korea's current lineup had genuine talent, and their top proximity player had a speed profile that matched anyone in the world. But even the polite ones had a specific quality to how they looked at him. Respectful on the surface, unconvinced underneath. He was a historical figure, a museum exhibit. They were working professionals. Jiho introduced the roster one by one. Most of the names passed without incident. Then there was Han, Jiho's daughter. She'd developed as an Esper in her late teens and worked a support role, a specialist position that assisted teammates in combat rather than engaging enemies directly. Her numbers in the support metrics were clean, and her coordination ratings were strong. The coaching staff liked her where she was. Yaop watched her run one routine in the module. Afterward, he told Jiho, quietly, that she was in the wrong position. Jiho blinked. Yaop said he wanted to look at her statistics properly. He had an ability he hadn't disclosed to the association evaluators, one called Scanner Eyes on the Dungeon Skill Register. It let him read any individual's complete attribute profile, current stats, hidden passive abilities, future skill potential, and the gap between what they were doing with themselves and what they were actually built to do. He used it the way other people used film study, except it took 3 seconds and returned perfect information. What he found in Han's profile made him pause. Her raw speed rating and proximity engagement instincts were in the top tier of anything he'd scanned since returning to the surface. She wasn't a support player. She was an aggressive, close-range fighter being funneled into a role that worked against her natural instincts, suppressing the very things that made her dangerous. He told Jiho he wanted her reassigned to proximity dealer before the USA match. Jiho said that was 6 days away. Yaop said he was aware of that. Jiho looked like a man trying to find a way to object and not managing it. He said they could try it. The Korea versus USA match drew a large broadcast audience. Pre-match commentary settled on a consensus. The USA team was favored, Walker's defensive unit was the best in the world, and Korea's last-minute roster changes were puzzling and probably ill-advised. Yaop sat on the Korean bench in his street clothes. He was there as an observer, officially. The cameras found him every few minutes regardless, and commentators mentioned him every time the cameras found him, because that was how these things worked. Set 1 went the way the USA expected. Korea lost it 11-0. The Korean players came back to the sideline with the flat, drained look of people who'd run into a wall. Several of them glanced at Yaop. He looked back at each of them without expression. He waited until the noise settled. What he said then was brief. He told them something almost no one in modern competitive play knew. The map for Set 2, a reconstruction of a dungeon called Martha Bourne's Palace, had a hidden passage in the left corridor. He'd cleared the original version of that dungeon in 2003. The passage led to a teleportation junction that deposited you inside the enemy team's rear approach line. He told Han exactly what he needed from her. He told the rest of the team how to hold long enough for it to matter. Set 2 began 15 minutes later. The USA came in expecting a standard match. Walker's formation was the same clean, dominant structure from Set 1. They moved up the main corridor with practiced precision, and Korea met them at the midpoint and held. Barely, expensively, just long enough. Han took the hidden passage alone and emerged behind the American rear line. The things that had been sitting dormant in her skill set, pressured down for years into a role that didn't fit her, suddenly had room to operate. She dropped 2 players before Walker understood which direction the problem was coming from. Korea scored 5 kills in set 2. Not enough to take the series. The USA won. But 5 kills against Walker's unit, 5 kills after an 11-0 collapse, was the kind of result that made coaches watch the replay and didn't leave you feeling entirely like the loser you technically were. Afterward, in the parking lot outside, Han found Yaop and stood beside him without speaking for a moment. She asked if he'd seen what she was capable of from the beginning, whether he'd known, when he looked at her in that training room, what she could actually do. Yaop told her yes. She was quiet again, the way people get when a simple answer lands heavier than they expected. Then she said it felt strange to hear that. Good, but strange. He said most true things did. She almost smiled. He didn't notice because he was already looking at his phone, where Jiho had sent a message about the upcoming charity match and a formal request from the national program for continued involvement. He read it once, put his phone away, and looked up at the sky above the parking lot. The air was warmer than he remembered Seoul being in autumn. He wasn't sure if that was climate or a fault in his memory. 17 years was a long time to trust a recollection. The world outside the dungeon had textures again in any case, sound and temperature, and the smell of wet pavement under streetlights. He wasn't going to take that for granted. There was something, though. Something at the edge of things he couldn't name yet. The faint wrongness you sense before you can point to it. Before it has any form. He had spent 17 years learning to trust that instinct. He filed it away and walked toward Jiho's car. The charity match proposal came through the association the following week, wrapped in the language of goodwill events and public engagement, but carrying the obvious commercial weight of the Walker clip still circulating across every major sports platform. Yaop read the paperwork Jiho brought him, set it aside, and picked it up again an hour later. He had one condition. Jiho would play alongside him. The silence that followed this was longer than most silences Jiho produced. He was the national head coach. He was 43. He had not competed at any official level in 11 years, and the body that had once been an S-rank Esper's body had, in the intervening decade, developed the specific softness of a man who spent his professional time in chairs watching other people train. Yaop looked at him and waited. Jiho said that was absolutely not something he could agree to. Yaop said that was fine, then he wouldn't play. Jiho said, more slowly this time, that it was a charity event, that people were expecting a special occasion, that saying no would look strange. Yaop said looking strange had never particularly bothered him. Another silence. Jiho put his hands flat on the table between them and looked at the wall with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he already knew the answer to. He said, "How long did they have before the event?" Yaop said 4 weeks. Jiho asked what 4 weeks of training would involve. Yaop told him. It was detailed and specific and covered approximately 90 seconds of explanation, and by the end of it, Jiho's hands had come off the table and were sitting in his lap. He said that would kill him. Yaop said it probably wouldn't. Jiho said he meant that metaphorically. Yaop said he hadn't meant it literally either, but the distinction was closer than Jiho seemed to think. There was a moment. Then Jiho said, quietly, with the particular helplessness of someone who knows they're already going to agree, that he would do it. The training sessions were early. 5 o'clock, before the facility's regular staff arrived. Yaop set the parameters based on what Jiho's body could currently do, and then raised them incrementally and without sentiment. He wasn't cruel about it. He wasn't kind about it either. He assessed, adjusted, and pushed, the way a person does when they understand precisely how much the human body can be asked of before it breaks, and intends to find that line without crossing it. Jiho threw up twice in the first week. He texted Yaop both times. Yaop replied to the first text asking if he needed medical attention and did not reply to the second one. By week 3, the sessions were running clean. Jiho's movement recovered something it had lost, a particular sharpness of reaction, the kind you only rebuild by being put under genuine pressure repeatedly. He couldn't get back to what he'd been at 30, but what he could access was real. Yaop watched him work and said, at the end of one session, that he would be fine. Jiho sat on the floor with a towel over his face and said he was glad someone thought so. The official evaluation came the same week. Standard procedure for any Esper competing in formal events. Attribute verification, ability confirmation, rank calibration. Yaop arrived with no particular interest in the results. Numbers had never been the point for him. The agility assessment used a timed multi-obstacle course that had been designed, according to the evaluator who ran it, to produce scores that realistically mapped to field performance. The upper range of recorded scores was held by Nathan Bernard, the world's top individual ranked player at the time, who had run the course at 107. Yaop ran it at 107. The evaluator checked the system twice. Then she wrote it down without saying anything. The aura measurement came last. Aura was the combat energy that powered Esper abilities. It had a standard human ceiling of 100, beyond which no verified score had been recorded in official association records. The equipment was calibrated to measure up to 150 as a technical formality. The number that came back was 1020. A second evaluator was called in. A third. They ran the test with different calibration settings and got the same result. Nobody in the room said anything for a while. Yaop asked if they were done. One of the evaluators asked, very carefully, whether he had disclosed all of this in his initial hospital assessment. Yaop said the hospital assessment hadn't asked him for this particular information, and he hadn't volunteered it. He signed the verification forms, collected his copy, and walked out. Jiho, waiting in the hallway with 2 coffees, looked at the paper and then looked at Yaop with an expression that was roughly equal parts pride and despair. He handed Yaop the coffee and said nothing, which was the appropriate response. The cult found him first. They'd been operating quietly under the name the Seo Menon Foundation, a private organization that had formed in the years following the Dungeon era, built around a theology that treated Somman Yaop as a divine figure. Their literature, which Jiho had quietly collected and brought to Yaop's attention with the air of someone presenting a document they wished they didn't have to, suggested that Yaop's survival of the final dungeon was proof of celestial mandate and that his return in 2021 was a prophesied event with cosmological significance. There were about 40 members. They had rented a meeting hall and were holding gatherings 3 times a week. Yaop read the literature. He set it down. He asked Jiho for the meeting hall address. Jiho said what he was planning wasn't going to help his public image. Yaop said he understood that. Jiho said, specifically, that showing up at a religious gathering involving 40 people who worshipped you and physically confronting them was the kind of thing that generated difficult headlines. Yaop said he appreciated the context and asked for the address again. He went on a Tuesday evening. The meeting had already started. He walked in through the side door while a man at the front of the room was mid-speech, found an empty chair near the back, and sat down. Several of the attendees noticed him immediately, and the speaker's voice stopped. What happened over the next 20 minutes was, by any reasonable standard, unusual. Yaop did not speak to them as a figure would speak to followers, or as a celebrity would speak to fans, or as a patient person would speak to the confused. He spoke to them the way he'd have spoken to people blocking a corridor he needed to move through. He told them plainly that he was not divine, not prophesied, and not interested in being treated as either. He told them that the thing he'd done in the final dungeon was survivorship, not theology, the result of not dying when everything around him was trying to make him die, for 17 continuous years, which was not a spiritual experience but a deeply unpleasant one. He told them that continuing this organization was something he was asking them to stop. When 3 of the more committed members tried to argue, citing their own literature, the evaluations, the aura score that had been leaked through an association administrative error the previous day, Yaop moved through the room in a way that ended the conversation more efficiently than further words would have. He wasn't gentle. He wasn't excessive. He applied the minimum physical pressure required to produce the maximum shift in behavior, and by the end of it, the meeting hall was quiet, and several chairs were on the floor, and 40 people were looking at him with an expression that suggested their theology might need revision. He told them, on his way out, that they were free to do what they liked with their personal beliefs, but that this specific organization should dissolve. It dissolved within the week. The headlines were, as Jiho had predicted, not easy. Yaop ignored them, which was also as Jiho had predicted. The charity match event was held at the National Arena, a venue large enough that every seat was occupied well before the first match began. 2 rounds were planned. Round 1 was a monster hunting match format, both teams clearing waves of dungeon enemies in parallel. Round 2 was a direct combat bracket, opposing teams trying to eliminate each other. Yaop had been assigned to a mixed team with Jiho and 3 national players, including a proximity dealer named Chohook, who was officially registered as a close-range fighter. Yaop had reviewed his stats beforehand and found something the coaching staff had apparently not looked for: a hidden passive in Chohook's profile that wasn't listed in his registered abilities, a durability passive. The kind that made hits absorb rather than accumulate damage in the way standard combatants experienced it. The kind that made him, in practical terms, exactly what a tank player needed to be. Yaop told Chohook before round 1 that he was playing tank today. Chohook said he was a proximity dealer. Yaop said he was aware of what was on Chohook's card and told him again, more specifically, what he'd found in his passive profile. Chohook was quiet for a moment. He said he didn't know he had that. Yaop said most people didn't know what they actually had. That was most of the problem. Round 1 opened with the Monster Wave format. The crowd noise was immediate and sustained. This was the kind of event the Korean public had developed real appetite for, and Somman Yaop appearing in any official capacity pulled viewership that stretched to other countries. Jiho, who had not been in a formal competition for over a decade, and had spent the last 4 weeks in training sessions that he would later describe using language he didn't usually permit himself, moved with something the broadcast cameras would spend considerable time analyzing. Not youth exactly, not the profile of a 22-year-old Esper at peak performance, but something recovered, something that had been buried under administrative work and board meetings and the slow accumulation of years, returned to the surface by pressure and repetition. Yaop worked the spear. He used a technique that had no name in any current training manual because it predated the VR era entirely. He called it the 100-centimeter throw privately, which was a practical name for a practical principle. A spear thrown from that specific distance, at that specific angle, with the rotation he'd developed over years of throwing implements at monsters who were actively trying to remove his various limbs, was lethal with a consistency approaching certainty. Monsters that appeared at range were down before the broadcast cameras finished panning to them. Monsters that came in close encountered Chohook's newly assigned tank positioning, held for the 3 seconds needed, and then weren't there anymore. The crowd was loud. Jiho, moving through a coordinated pattern Yaop had explained in 17 words that morning, was working correctly. There was a quality to seeing someone fulfill the purpose they were built for, and Jiho, running a support and flank line with the exact footwork Yaop had drilled into him over 4 painful weeks, looked more like himself than he had in years. They cleared round 1 with the fastest monster completion time on record for that venue. Round 2 was the direct combat bracket. The opposing team was the national selection squad, 11 players including several of Korea's current best. They were there in good faith. This was a charity event. They were professionals with reputations to maintain, and they were not expecting to be humiliated. The format for round 2 was a capture-the-point system inside a dungeon map called the Labyrinth, a reconstruction of a real structure Yaop had cleared in 2006. Tight corridors, multiple levels, 3 control nodes that shifted in location every 7 minutes. The opposing team came in organized. Point distribution, role assignments, communication structure all tight. Their strategy was conservative and correct. Control 2 of the 3 nodes, funnel the opposing team into choke points, eliminate 1 player at a time. Yaop told his teammates something before they entered the module. He told them to hold their positions and not move forward. Jiho looked at him. Yaop said he would handle round 2 personally. The silence that followed this was the kind that happens when people want to ask a question, but sense that asking it would not result in useful new information. They went in. The labyrinth was narrow and dark and had 7 floors, each branching off the central column at irregular intervals. 11 players on the opposing team moved through it in 3 groups, coordinated, covering angles, playing the map they'd studied. Yaop moved alone. He had cleared the original version of this dungeon in 2006 and had navigated it enough times in those early years that its architecture lived in his spatial memory as clearly as the floor plan of a house he'd lived in. The corridors ran in patterns that the VR reconstruction mapped accurately because the data was pulled from actual structural scans. Every routing junction, every ceiling thickness, every angle at which a thrown weapon would carry through an intervening floor. He heard the first group before he saw them. Sound traveled in a particular way in the labyrinth corridors, a function of the stone material and ceiling height, and he tracked their movement by the echo distribution across the competing angles. He moved to a position 2 levels above their current route, gauged the geometry, and threw. The spear went through the ceiling. The broadcast cameras, picking up the throw on one feed and the impact on a separate floor camera 12 meters below, had to be replayed 3 times before the commentary team agreed on what had happened. A thrown weapon striking targets through an intervening floor at that angle should not have been possible under any reasonable interpretation of the match's physics parameters. The match arbiters ran a review and confirmed no violation of module rules. The system permitted structural penetration for thrown projectiles. No one had designed around it because no one had thought to try it. 2 players down, the second group was on floor 4, holding the eastern node, and they heard the news over their communication feed and adjusted their formation. They were good players. They contracted into a defensive circle, the correct response to an unknown threat pattern, minimal exposure, maximum mutual coverage. Yaop came from the corridor behind the circle's south edge, which required a routing path through the maintenance junction below floor 3 that was not marked on any distributed map of this dungeon. He'd found the junction in 2006 when a monster knocked him through the wrong wall. He moved through it fast. 4 of the second group went down in under 90 seconds. The third group, 5 players including the team captain, received a feed from the module's internal cameras and saw, at this point, that the match they were playing bore almost no resemblance to what they'd prepared for. Their captain was experienced enough to understand that reorganizing their strategy at this juncture would take time they didn't have. She made a reasonable decision: consolidate on the final node, stack all 5 players at a choke point, and meet whatever was coming head-on. It was the right call in theory. A 5-player stack at a choke point is difficult to break and nearly impossible to sweep quickly. The difficulty was that Yaop had cleared this dungeon enough times to know what the geometry of that particular choke point looked like from 3 floors above it, and what angle the ceiling took at that junction, and how the load-bearing columns were distributed. He didn't attack through the choke point. He attacked through the load-bearing section above it. The VR system, running on the structural fidelity parameters of the original dungeon scan, processed the physics correctly. The ceiling section destabilized, the floor above the choke point gave way, and 5 players who had prepared to hold a corridor found themselves managing sudden structural collapse from above. The last elimination registered on the scoreboard at 18 minutes and 44 seconds from match start. Yaop had not taken a single tagged hit. The commentary team went quiet for a few seconds after the scoreboard updated. Then one of them said, slowly, that the final score was 11-0 in favor of Yaop's team. A different voice said, Somman Yaop had personally recorded 11 eliminations. The first voice said, in a single match. The second voice said, yes. There was a pause. The first voice said that this was, to his knowledge, an all-time record in any format of competitive VR battlefield. Nobody contradicted him. The noise level in the arena after the final scoreboard updated was the kind of noise that a building produces when the people inside it have witnessed something that exceeds the frame they brought in with them. It wasn't the crowd response to a skilled player, or a close match, or a comeback. It was a different quality. The sound people make when their understanding of what's possible in a given activity has just been revised upward by a significant amount, and they haven't processed it yet. Yaop walked back to the staging area and sat down on a bench and waited for his water bottle, which Jiho brought him. Jiho sat down beside him. He'd been in the match, holding his position as instructed for its entire duration. He set his own gear down and looked at the scoreboard one more time through the glass partition. He said, 11. Yaop said yes. Jiho said he had played esports professionally for 22 years and had never seen anyone do that. Yaop said he'd had a lot of time to practice. Jiho made a sound, not quite a laugh. The kind of sound a person makes when something is too large to fully respond to and so they don't try. Outside the glass partition, Yaop could see the arena floor where cameras were still running, and the broadcast team was talking, and analysts were already pulling replay clips from 4 different angles. The people who had spent the last 2 weeks running pieces about outdated legacies and historical records with no modern relevance were going to have a different conversation tomorrow morning. Some of them would manage the shift gracefully. Others would find a new framing. He was performing in a controlled charity format. The opponents weren't at full strength. The structural attack was a technicality. The numbers would look different in official competition. He already knew those conversations would happen and couldn't be bothered about them. What mattered was simpler. The gap between what people assumed about him and what was actually true was, tonight, public knowledge. The entire analytical apparatus of competitive VR Battlefield had been looking at him the way people look at a painting in a museum, with cultural appreciation and no real expectation that it would do anything. Tonight it had done something. He finished his water. There was a pension settlement waiting for him. The association had sent preliminary paperwork 2 days ago, a back pay calculation for 17 years that came to approximately 2.5 billion won. He hadn't opened the documents yet. He needed, he realized, to think about what came next. Not quietly watching television, something that used more of what he'd spent 17 years building. He had a thought that he let sit for a moment before examining it, the way you test ice before putting your weight on it. A club, his own club. The infrastructure was already there. VR Battlefield had a second division league, a KB2, with clubs that could be purchased if you had capital and the right registration standing. There were players out there the current system wasn't reading correctly. He'd already seen it with Han, with Cho Huk. Players assigned the wrong roles, their actual capacity buried under conventional assessments that didn't know what to look for. He knew what to look for. He set the empty water bottle down beside him and watched the arena through the glass. Jiho glanced over and seemed to read something in the quality of the silence, because he didn't say anything. He waited, which was a skill Jiho had always had, the patience to let a thought develop in the person beside him without interrupting it. After a while, Yaop said there was a club in KB2 he'd like Jiho to look into. Jiho said, KB2. Yaop said yes. Jiho said, you want to build a club. Yaop said he wanted to build the right club. There was a difference. Jiho looked at the arena floor again. He had the expression of a man computing something with many variables. Then he said, simply, without ceremony, that he'd pull the available listings in the morning. Yaop said that would work. The arena was still loud outside the glass. Inside the room it was quiet, and the two of them sat in that quiet with the easy familiarity of people who had operated alongside each other in much worse conditions and didn't need to make anything of the fact that they were still here. The pension settlement arrived as a direct transfer on a Wednesday morning. 2,500 million won, representing 17 years of outstanding compensation at 7 heroes classification rates, plus statutory interest. Yaop stared at the figure on his banking application. Jiho had helped him set up the account the previous week, and felt nothing particularly dramatic about it. Money had been abstract for a long time. In the dungeon it had no function at all, and he'd lost the instinct for its weight. What he felt instead was the practical clarity of someone who now had a tool and needed to decide what to build with it. He called Jiho and told him to move on the club listing. The club in question was called Hanjong Industry, a KB2 team with a respectable history, a small but functional training facility in the Eastern District, and a current financial position that had been deteriorating for 3 seasons. Their roster had been strong once. Their management hadn't kept pace. The asking price was workable, the association paperwork for ownership transfer was standard, and Jiho knew every person in the administrative chain who needed to sign something. It took 11 days. At the end of those 11 days, Yaop owned a VR Esports club. He renamed it YSM. He didn't explain the naming to anyone who asked, and enough people asked that eventually they stopped. The first thing he did with the facility was change the training schedule. The second thing was change the meal program. The third thing was sit in the club's small film room alone for 6 hours, watching recorded footage of every KB2 team currently in the lower half of the standings, looking for specific things that other coaches weren't looking for. He was looking for gaps, players filed in roles that didn't fit them, players whose registration stats told one story while their in-match behavior told another. Scanner eyes gave him the underlying data, but footage gave him context. How someone moved under pressure, where they hesitated, which habits they'd built to compensate for something they didn't know they had. By the end of the first week, he had 3 names. The first was Lee Naeon. She appeared in footage from a KB2 regional qualifier, playing for a club that had released her 2 months later citing inconsistent performance. In official terms, she was an archery specialist. Ranged combat, medium-distance engagement. Her accuracy numbers were functional but unremarkable. Her registered movement speed was solid, Her actual speed, what Yaop saw under scanner eyes, was exceptional. Not just movement speed, the full cognitive processing cycle, the gap between stimulus and response that determined how fast a player could read and react to a developing situation. She was also running a playstyle in that footage that was fundamentally mismatched to archery. She kept closing distance when she should have been holding range, kept trying to get inside opponents' guard rather than picking them off at distance. Her club had assessed this as poor decision-making. Yaop read it differently. She was built for close harassment, for a specific style of high-speed engagement that didn't have a clean name in standard tactical terminology. He had a name for it. He'd seen it in the dungeon, in a particular type of creature that didn't fight you directly but orbited your engagement, disrupting timing, stealing initiative, making you chase something fast enough that you committed resources to the wrong threat. He called it mind thief tactics. You didn't need to land killing blows yourself. You needed to be the thing that made opponents miss. The second name was Sung Ho, a delivery driver who had developed Esper abilities at 24, later than average, which meant the competitive academies had overlooked him entirely. His official registration listed 2 abilities: object teleportation at short range, and a passive visual relay that allowed him to share his current field of vision with teammates during active combat. Neither of these was a combat skill in conventional terms. No club had drafted him. Yaop looked at what those 2 skills were actually capable of doing in combination with a fast, pressure-oriented player like Neon, and understood immediately why no one had drafted him. The combinatorial value required seeing both players as a system rather than individuals, and the standard scouting process evaluated individuals. He sent Jiho to find them both. Neon came in skeptical. She sat across from Yaop in the club's small conference room and had the tight, controlled posture of someone who had been released from 2 clubs and wasn't interested in performing enthusiasm for a third. Yaop didn't ask her to. He told her what he'd observed in the qualifier footage, specifically, clinically, the exact moments where she'd tried to close distance instead of holding range, and what that pattern told him about her actual instincts. She went still in a way that was different from defensiveness. He told her what he had in mind. A role that didn't exist in any current team manual. A high-speed harassment dealer who used Sung Ho's vision relay to operate in your opponent's periphery, stealing priority kills before their damage dealers registered the engagement. Mind thief. She would need to learn a specific movement pattern. Her archery skills were secondary to this. What mattered was her speed and her instinct to get inside. She asked, after a moment, whether he was certain about the speed assessment. Her evaluation scores hadn't shown anything that would support what he was describing. He told her what her actual speed profile read under proper analysis. The number was specific enough that she sat back in her chair. She said she'd like to try it. Sung Ho came in 2 days later with grease on his jacket from the delivery job and the slightly bewildered expression of someone who had received a call from a professional esports club and wasn't sure what the catch was. Yaop explained his role in the same specific terms. Sung Ho asked 3 questions, all practical, about how the vision relay interacted with combat proximity and whether his teleportation range could be extended through training. They were good questions. Yaop answered them. Sung Ho asked when he could start. The KB2 season opened in March. YSM's first 5 matches went in a direction that generated exactly the kind of attention Yaop had anticipated, and the broadcast analysts had not. The Mind Thief strategy worked because it required the opposing team to solve a problem they hadn't encountered before. Neon entered engagement range before standard protocol suggested an attacker should, moving at a speed that put her inside the response window before defensive positioning could complete. Sung Ho's vision relay meant she never needed to visually track her targets independently. The spatial picture came to her through a shared feed, letting her move without looking, which was the thing that made her speed terrifying rather than merely impressive. By the time the opposing team's damage dealers understood the threat geometry, Neon had already changed it. The kill-steal element was precise and infuriating to defend against. She wasn't landing the heaviest damage. She was arriving at the exact moment a target's health hit the critical threshold and finishing them, denying the scoring credit to the player who'd done the work of wearing them down. It broke the psychological rhythm of matches in a way that was harder to adapt to than a straightforward power disadvantage. 5 matches, 5 wins. YSM moved up the KB2 standings and the league's tactical discussion forums started running threads about what, exactly, they were watching. Yaop read some of the forum posts. A few of them were close. None of them were quite right. The tank problem needed solving separately. Cho Huk had played the charity match well in the tank position, but was formally registered and contracted as a proximity dealer for a different club, Moonong FC, managed by a coach named Choi Moonong. Transferring him required either standard contract negotiation or something less procedural, and standard negotiation with Choi Moonong was going to be slow and expensive and was likely to fail. Yaop knew Choi Moonong from before, not personally. Their paths hadn't crossed in the professional structure, but from records. In 2006, during a joint dungeon raid that Yaop had participated in for one session before departing, Moonong had been the tactical coordinator for the second party. A series of decisions he'd made during that session had resulted in 4 of his own players dying on a floor they should have cleared safely. The inquiry afterward had been brief and inconclusive, and Moonong had continued his career. Yaop mentioned this to Choi Moonong at the beginning of their meeting, which took place in a coffee shop near the club's district office. He mentioned it specifically, the floor number, the date, the nature of the decisions, and the names of the players who hadn't made it out. Moonong's cup stopped moving to his mouth. Yaop continued. He said he wasn't planning to take the story anywhere in particular. He was planning to complete his coffee and leave. What he did afterward would depend on how the Cho Huk transfer discussion went. The transfer went smoothly. 50 million won, which was approximately 1/10 of Cho Huk's market value by any reasonable competitive assessment. The paperwork was signed the following afternoon. Jiho, who had not been in the coffee shop but had received a summary afterward, said he was fairly certain what had just happened wasn't legal. Yaop said it wasn't illegal. There was a difference. Jiho said he was going to sit with that distinction for a while. The Paris trip came out of registration requirements. Official Global Pro certification, needed for international match eligibility, required in-person processing at one of 6 regional association offices. The European office was in Paris. Jiho booked the flights with the efficiency of someone who has spent decades managing logistics and has no remaining capacity to be surprised by the people he manages them for. Han came. She was operating now as YSM's primary proximity dealer and had been running drills with a set of standard combat spears that Yaop had told her, twice, were not correctly weighted for her movement profile. She hadn't found alternatives yet. Paris solved that incidentally. The Moreau brothers, a pair of master equipment fabricators who operated out of a workshop in the 11th arrondissement that looked from the outside like a modest sporting goods repair shop and was from the inside something significantly more serious, had been contracted to build spears for a previous 7 hero and had Yaop's old specification files in their archive. They spent an afternoon with him measuring updated parameters and produced 2 folding spears, the shaft collapsing to 1/3 of full length for transport and deployment at speed, that he described as acceptable and that the Moreau brothers received as the highest praise they'd heard in years. He ordered a set for Han as well. She tested the weight in the workshop and said nothing, which was how she expressed satisfaction. Nathan Bernard found him. Not through the association scheduling system or formal challenge protocols. He simply appeared at the hotel training annex on the second morning, which suggested he'd done some research into Yaop's Paris schedule that the privacy guidelines around official visits didn't technically permit, but nobody was going to enforce. He was younger than his ranking suggested, 26, with the clean, composed movement of someone who had been told he was exceptional since his early teens and had the character to be genuinely good rather than merely confident about it. He asked Yaop, directly and without preamble, for a duel. He said he'd been studying the Walker match for 3 months, and the Labyrinth footage. He said there were things in that footage he didn't understand and wanted to. Yaop looked at him for a moment. He said they could use the Association Annex module. The parameters they set were full ability engagement, no restrictions. Yaop did not lock out his immortality this time, not because he planned to use it, but because he wanted Nathan to operate without knowing which cards were off the table. Nathan was the best opponent Yaop had faced since returning to the surface. His technical range was complete. No gaps in the diagonal he'd found in Walker, no structural weaknesses in his footwork, a reaction cycle fast enough that Yaop's first 3 approaches required genuine thought rather than the quick geometric calculations the Walker match had demanded. His clone ability, a technique that produced a combat-capable mirror of himself capable of operating as an independent attacker, was particularly well developed, the kind of skill that became dangerous not because it was overwhelming, but because it forced you to solve a two-target problem with inconsistent threat priority. They ran hard for 6 minutes. Yaop allowed the clone to make contact on his left arm, not because he had to, he could have avoided it, but because the geometry the clone's attack created opened a specific response window on Nathan's primary position that wouldn't exist otherwise. The arm registered a full impact. The VR system's damage parameters marked it as an elimination-level strike. Under the module's standard rules, Yaop was done. He wasn't done. He'd asked to run with immortality active. The system allowed it. The arm was gone by the module's physics, and the regeneration kicked in over the following seconds, and the response window it had purchased was still there. He moved through it. The duel ended. Nathan stood very still for a moment. He looked at Yaop's arm, whole again, the regeneration complete, and asked, carefully, whether that was the immortality ability the records mentioned. Yaop said it was. Nathan asked how Yaop had known the arm would provide enough of an opening. Yaop told him the geometry. The angle the clone's attack committed to, the positioning it required Nathan to hold to give the clone the right vector, the time window the commitment left at Nathan's rear left before he could re-engage. Nathan was quiet, processing this, in the way someone is quiet when information arrives that requires recalibrating how they understand their own technique. He asked if Yaop would consider a formal match during YSM's European eligibility period. Yaop said he'd be willing, and then, standing in the module recovery zone with the annex's ventilation system running its low background hum, Yaop felt it more clearly than he had in Seoul, the edge of something. Not a noise, not a specific threat. The way the air had a quality to it that was slightly wrong, the particular resonance of an energy signature that didn't belong. He'd learned in the dungeon to trust that kind of perception without requiring it to be legible yet. He told Nathan the session was over, walked to the module exit, and stood in the hallway outside the annex with his hand against the wall. Somewhere in this city, something was generating an aura field that matched a classification he recognized from the dungeon's deeper levels. Blue at the edge, getting toward red. He had a name for things that generated that field. Buer, underworld entities, remnants of the dungeon era that had survived the closing of the rifts, operating somewhere in the urban infrastructure of a city that didn't know what to look for. He used amplification for the first time that evening. The ability was a consequence of the mentality stat breaking past the human ceiling. When the number hit 110, something in the skill architecture of his Esper profile had restructured itself, the way a system reconfigures when you exceed its designed parameters. Amplification let him push any current skill past its standard operational ceiling, extend its range, modify its effect. He'd been holding it in reserve, running the standard version of everything, because amplification carried a cost in activation time and energy output that made casual use impractical. But the aura signature he'd felt was north of the hotel, and north was Paris spread across 12 arrondissements of buildings and underground infrastructure, and scanner eyes at standard range covered approximately a 400-meter radius. He needed more radius. He pulled amplification up against the immortality ability instead. The standard version of immortality protected his physical body from lethal damage and regenerated injuries. The amplified version did something different. It took the energy his body used for physical persistence, the continuous field that made tissue repair automatic, and inverted its orientation outward, converting it into a projected aura field that made his physical form briefly intangible. Not invisible. He still occupied space and generated light, more light than was comfortable, a pale luminescence that he noted with some irritation would be visible from a distance. But the physical substance of him shifted into something between states. Solid enough to be present, light enough to move at a speed that his standard physical form couldn't sustain. He had 120 seconds. He went through the window rather than the hallway, which was faster, and moved over Paris at an altitude that kept him above the roofline. The Seine caught his reflection somewhere below him, a glowing point against the dark water, and the Eiffel Tower's light structure was visible to the southwest, gold against the clouds, and he registered it as beautiful in the brief, noting way of someone who doesn't have time to stop. The aura signature was 600 meters north of the hotel, in the basement infrastructure below a transit junction. He pinpointed it, mapped it, confirmed the classification. Blue edging red. a Class 2 proximity to a Class 3 marker, an underworld presence that had been here long enough to establish a signal. He had 40 seconds left when he landed on the hotel roof. He stood there while the intangibility faded out and his mass returned and made a note of the junction's location and the specific frequency of the signature, which would tell him something about the entity's origin point when he had time to cross-reference it against the dungeon classification records he'd carried out of the final level. Then he went back through the window he'd left by, it was still open, and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall. The world was not as clean as the association documentation suggested. The dungeon era was not as over as the VR esports industry needed it to be. Something had stayed behind when the rifts closed. Something had been operating in the spaces between the bright new infrastructure of 2021 and whatever the nature of the primordial light threat that the deeper dungeon levels had hinted at, the thing he'd caught fragments of in the final year, in the behavior of the entities at the last levels, in the way the dungeon itself had seemed to know it was running out of time. It wasn't finished. He had been the one who pushed through to the end, because no one else was left to do it. He was here now because the same logic applied. He picked up his phone and sent Jiho a message. It said, "Find an analyst who can run YSM strategic operations. I need to focus on other things." Jiho's reply came in under 3 minutes. It said, "I may have someone. French. Her name is Gabrielle Sana." Yaop put the phone down and looked at the ceiling. Paris was quiet outside the window. The city was full of light and its own noise, ordinary and alive, and entirely unaware that something was operating in its foundations. He had work to do. Gabrielle Sana met him in a café near the 6th arrondissement on his last morning in Paris, and she arrived 12 minutes early and had already ordered and was reading a document on her tablet when Yaop came in. That told him something before he sat down. She was 29, Korean French, and had spent the previous 4 years as a strategic analyst for 2 of Europe's top KB1 clubs. Her record was clean. Both clubs had improved their ranking position during her tenure and declined after she left, which was either a coincidence or a data point, and she clearly believed it was a data point. She had the particular confidence of someone who had been right about enough things to stop apologizing for being certain. She had also, apparently, been following YSM's KB2 run from Europe, which she mentioned at the beginning of the meeting in a way that was neither flattering nor neutral, just informational. Yaop laid out the terms: full strategic operations control for YSM's coaching system, scouting analysis, match preparation, tactical communication. She would have authority over the club's analytical infrastructure and direct input on roster decisions. In exchange, the contract required YSM to achieve KB1 promotion within the season. Gabrielle set her tablet down and asked him to confirm that last part. He confirmed it. She said that was an unusual guarantee to build into an employment contract. He said he was aware of that. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said she had one additional term. Yaop himself would play in a minimum of 3 official matches per year, which she specified not for commercial reasons, though it was commercially relevant, but because she'd watched the Labyrinth footage multiple times and had specific analytical questions about his decision-making at minute 14 that she needed answered from inside a match context. Yaop said that was acceptable. She picked up her tablet, made a note, and said she'd review the contract language with her lawyer and be in touch by Friday. She was in touch by Thursday. Yunbom was the problem Yaop couldn't solve from a distance. He appeared in local recruitment footage, a shy university student, mid-sized, with the specific quality of someone who had always been slightly behind their own potential and had learned to operate inside that gap rather than outside it. His listed ability was shadow walking, a movement technique that allowed him to slip through physical space using shadow coverage as a transit medium, emerging at a different shadow within range. In theory, it was a devastating tool for an assassin-style player. In practice, Yunbom's execution was hesitant. He entered the shadow correctly but paused at the threshold before emerging, a fraction of a second that was all any prepared opponent needed to track him. The hesitation wasn't technical. The shadow walk mechanism in his profile was sound under scanner eyes. The hesitation was in the user. Yaop thought about this for 3 days. Then he arranged a training contract for Yunbom, had Jiho drive him to a location outside the city, and showed him a cave. Not a large cave. A dry one, at a reasonable altitude, with good air circulation and adequate ambient light during daytime hours through two natural openings in the upper rock face. Yaop had inspected it himself and confirmed it was safe in the ways that mattered. He told Yunbom he would be staying inside for 10 days. Yunbom asked about food, which was a practical question, and about training equipment, which was also practical, and then asked, with the careful phrasing of someone trying to establish whether this was a metaphor, whether he was actually expected to remain inside the cave. Yaop said he was. The principle was simple, though the experience of it was not. Shadow walking needed a practitioner who trusted the transit completely, not intellectually, not on paper, but in the body, in the half-second before the technique committed. That trust only developed through extended immersion, days in an environment where shadow was the primary feature of the landscape, where the choice to use the ability was routine rather than exceptional, where the hesitation had nothing left to push against, because moving through shadow was just how you got from one side of a space to the other. He left Yunbom with supplies, a sealed envelope to open on day 5 if things got difficult, and no further explanation. On day 3, Jiho said he was worried. Yaop said the envelope had a note in it. Jiho said a note wouldn't help if the kid was having a breakdown alone in a cave. Yaop said he'd chosen the cave partly because its shadow geometry was excellent, and partly because Yunbom had the specific character that responds to isolation by going inward and finding something, rather than going inward and going dark. He'd read it in their first conversation. Jiho asked how you could tell the difference between those two things from a single conversation. Yaop said you couldn't always. But the hesitation in Yunbom's technique wasn't fear of the dark. It was the hesitation of someone who had never been told that what they were capable of was worth committing to. That was a different problem with a different solution. Yunbom emerged on day 10. He looked thinner and had not shaved and had the particular quiet of someone who has spent 10 days with themselves and is still deciding how to feel about what they found. He walked into the YSM facility, went to the nearest VR module, and ran a solo shadow walk sequence that the facility's performance analytics flagged automatically because the speed and commitment numbers it produced were outside the expected range for a player at his registration level. He played his next KB2 match and went for an MVP score in an 11 win that sent YSM to the top of the promotion bracket. Yaop watched the match from the coaching observation room and said nothing about it. He pulled up Yunbom's statistics afterward and looked at the hesitation metric. It was gone. The transit was clean. Where there had been a fraction of a second of doubt at the threshold, there was now just movement, continuous, committed, the technique doing what it was designed to do. He filed the result away and moved to the next problem. The KB1 debut came in early autumn. YSM had earned promotion through the final weeks of the KB2 season, with a margin that left their ranking comfortable and their tactical reputation complicated. Analysts who'd spent months studying the Mind Thief strategy were already publishing adaptation guides, which meant the approach would need to evolve in KB1's deeper talent pool. Gabriel had 7 contingency structures prepared. Yaop had 2, and both of his were simpler than hers and, he estimated, more disruptive. The first KB1 match drew a broadcast audience that reflected the attention YSM had generated all season. The dungeon map assigned for the match was Thousand Bridges, a reconstruction of a real structure Yaop hadn't thought about in years, a layered combat environment built around a series of suspension bridges spanning a central void, stacked at varying altitudes with platform nodes at each anchor point. The opposing team played it conservatively. Hold the highest altitude bridge, control sight lines, use the vertical structure to filter approaches into defensible choke points. It was the correct strategy for that map against conventional opponents. Yaop studied the structural schematic in the pre-match review room for approximately 4 minutes and identified 3 things. The bridges were modeled from the original dungeon's physical data. The suspension architecture was accurate to the actual structure he'd cleared in 2007, which meant the load-bearing specifications were accurate, which meant the tension distribution at the anchor joints under concurrent occupancy stress was accurate, which meant the system had a failure threshold that matched the real dungeon's structural properties. The second thing was that Sung-ho's vision relay, operating from a position on the lowest bridge, covered all 11 opposing players if they were consolidated on the top platform. The third thing was that the vertical fall distance between the top platform and the lowest structural level, the void the bridges spanned, was 112 meters. He told Sung-ho his position. He told Neon her entry angle. He told the rest of the team to hold the lowest bridge and wait. When the match began, the opposing team moved to the high position as expected. Sung-ho established the relay. Yaop walked to the anchor joint of the second bridge from the top, found the specific stress point in the suspension architecture, and applied force at an angle that the dungeon's original physics had made catastrophic when the load was already at 80% capacity. The upper bridge failed, then the one below it. The cascade took 4 seconds and deposited 11 opposing players into freefall in the central void. In the VR module's physics system, freefall was a live combat state. You were not eliminated until you hit the lowest surface. 112 meters of falling took several seconds. Yaop jumped into the void after them. What the broadcast cameras picked up was something that the commentary team initially described as a targeting sequence and then corrected to human surfing when the replay showed clearly that Yaop was not falling so much as navigating, moving through the freefall space between 11 players who were also falling, adjusting trajectory with small movements, landing tag strikes that registered as eliminations before any of them reached the bottom. 11 eliminations. The match timer showed 6 minutes and 40 seconds. The broadcast team ran the replay immediately, then ran it again. Gabriel, in the coaching observation room, made a single notation in her match log and did not say anything. Kazakhstan was a different kind of cold. The scouting trip came out of a conversation with the Regional Association office, which had flagged a player competing in the Central Asian League whose statistics were generating attention for reasons the local coaching structure hadn't fully diagnosed. Yaop looked at the footage, used scanner eyes on the broadcast image quality, which was sufficient for a reading, barely, and booked a flight. Sonia Akhmatov was the daughter of Kazakhstan's association president, which was contextually interesting and practically irrelevant. She played shield tank, a defensive specialist role using a large format energy shield as her primary tool, focusing on protection and formation control rather than offensive output. Her numbers in that role were strong. Her ranking in the regional circuit was high. Under scanner eyes, she was not a shield tank. Her raw physical profile was built for close-range offensive work. Short reaction cycle, high force output, exceptional lateral movement. The shield was suppressing the most productive half of her skill set because someone early in her development had looked at her durability numbers and assigned her accordingly. He told her this directly, at a facility meeting that her father's administration had arranged under the assumption that it was a recruitment consultation. She said she'd been playing shield tank since she was 15. He said he understood that. She said her technique was ranked in the regional top 5. He said her technique was ranked in the regional top 5 for a role she wasn't built for, and that if she wanted to see what she was actually capable of, she should put the shield down. The silence that followed had a specific quality to it. Not offense, not dismissal, but the particular stillness of someone being offered something they hadn't known they were waiting for. He handed her a training spear. She held it wrong at first, the grip automatic from years of shield mechanics. He adjusted her hands without much ceremony. She ran a pattern, then another, faster, her body finding something in the movement that the shield had never let it find. By the end of the session, the lateral movement he'd read in her profile was visible to anyone watching without scanner eyes. The precise, efficient explosiveness of someone whose real technique had been waiting underneath the assigned one. He told her he wanted her at YSM, Dual Spear Close Range Dealer. He told her what the training would involve and what the contract terms were, and that she would need to be comfortable abandoning a defensive role entirely. She asked if he was certain about what she was capable of. He said he was. She said she'd come. Sonia's first KB1 match for YSM came against Seoul BC, who fielded one of the league's top defensive lineups and had won their previous 4 matches without conceding double digits. She opened the match with dual spears and the lateral footwork that had spent 9 years underneath a shield, and Seoul BC's formation, calibrated for a standard proximity dealer at this roster slot, had no prepared answer for what they were actually looking at. The final score was 9-0. Sonia's personal stats from the match were circulated in the KB1 analytical channels before the broadcast ended, and 3 clubs sent formal scouting inquiry requests to YSM by the following morning. Gabriel declined all of them in language that was professionally courteous and completely final. The Zadran seed arrived into relevance sideways. Eric Thiem, the 7 hero the records called God of the Axe, who had spent the years since the Dungeon era running a small sporting equipment business, and carefully avoiding association with the current esports industry, made contact through Jiho and came to the YSM facility on a Tuesday with a small case and the expression of someone delivering something they'd been holding too long. Inside the case was a dungeon return stone, a rare object from the dungeon era that functioned as a one-use key to a sealed private dungeon space. Individual clearers who had established a personal territory in the dungeon's middle levels could lock it behind one of these stones. Yaop had a private dungeon. He'd established it in Year 4, used it as a rest space and supply cache, and hadn't thought about it since the day he finally pushed through to the final level and left everything behind. The stone opened it cleanly. Inside, past a corridor that still had his supply markings on the walls, in a shorthand he'd developed to track his own passes, was the storage he'd left. Equipment, materials, a locked secondary chamber containing dungeon-level biological samples he'd collected, for reasons he couldn't now clearly reconstruct. One of these samples was a zadran seed, a plant specimen from the dungeon's deep agricultural level, capable of growing into something the size and temperament of a large, hostile tree if given organic material to feed on. He'd kept it sealed in a containment case. On the return from that access, he eliminated a Class 3 Buer searcher that had been operating in the dungeon's transit space, an underworld entity running a surveillance function, which meant something outside was monitoring this location. He executed it efficiently and extracted the signal record from its aura signature before it dissolved. The signal contained two pieces of information, a title, the Prophet, and a phrase in the old dungeon register that translated approximately as primordial light. He'd heard both before, in the final level, in the behavior of the entities that seemed to know the dungeon was ending. He brought the Zadran seed out with him, which was a decision that had consequences he didn't fully anticipate. A man named Petro Anella arrived at the YSM facility 3 weeks later. He represented the World Battlefield Association, the international body that oversaw the VR esports system globally. He was polite, formal, and offered 1 billion won for the Zadran seed without explaining why he wanted it. Yaop sold it. 1 billion won was useful and the seed was not. He had no practical application for it, and its containment was creating a low-level interference with the facility's VR module calibration. Anella took the seed, thanked him, and destroyed it on the spot, which was not what most buyers did immediately after purchase. Then Anella activated something, a transit stone, not the dungeon return variety but a different class, a teleportation anchor, and Yaop felt the space around him shift before he'd fully processed that the conversation had turned. He arrived somewhere underground. The chamber was old. Not dungeon old, human old, the kind of constructed space that had been built by people rather than grown by whatever process created dungeon architecture, but built long enough ago that the stone had the specific settled quality of something that had been in the ground for centuries. There was light from embedded luminescent elements, and there were figures at the far end of the chamber, and the nearest figure was not standing the way living things stand. The High Priest. The records called her that. The dungeon classification files from the early clearing era. An undead entity at the leadership tier of what the dungeon catalogs described as the underworld race, a population that had existed in the dungeon's deepest levels, with enough organization and culture to register as something more complex than monster fauna. She was tall, robed, and had the aura signature that Yaop's scanner eyes placed precisely. Underworld leadership class, active combat capability, and underneath both of those readings, something else. A secondary signature layered over the primary one, sitting wrong against the others. A compulsion seal. External origin. Someone had put a control mechanism on her. The fight was necessary and brief. She was capable. Dungeon leadership tier put her well above anything in the current esports circuit, and she moved with the efficiency of something that had been doing this for a very long time. Yaop took 3 solid hits, regenerated, and found the angles that existed regardless of the opponent's capability level, because angles existed in physics and physics didn't negotiate. He wasn't trying to eliminate her. He was trying to get close enough to the compulsion seal to break it. The seal was in the aura layer, a tightly wound structure in the signature he'd read on entry, tied to a specific frequency that he recognized from the deep dungeon, not natural underworld resonance. Something mimicking it, a false signal, running at the frequency of what the dungeon's deepest entities had called the primordial light. used as a control mechanism against someone who had been conditioned to respond to that frequency as authority. He broke it through direct aura contact, which required being inside her guard and sustaining contact for approximately 4 seconds while she tried to remove him. The regeneration handled the structural damage. The seal came apart. She stopped. She stood in the chamber and looked at her own hands and was quiet for a long time. She told him, when she spoke, that the voice she'd been following, the voice she'd understood as the primordial light's directive, had not been the primordial light. It had been something that could mimic the frequency. Something that had been using the underworld race the way you use a tool, directing them, shaping their behavior toward ends that served neither the underworld nor humanity. He asked if she knew what the something was. She said she knew its signal. She didn't know its origin. He said he'd encountered the same signal in the final dungeon's deepest level. In the last year, in the behavior of things that seemed to know what was coming. She looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has spent a very long time believing they were alone in a problem and has just discovered they weren't. The golden stone arrived in his hand without his having touched it, a transition that bypassed the physical logistics of receiving something and simply produced it in his closed fist, warm, with a resonance frequency he felt before he consciously registered the object. He used it. The space he arrived in was not underground. It was a room above a city, with floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 walls and a view that placed it at altitude, and the furnishings were the kind that communicated neither wealth nor austerity, but precision. Everything exactly where it needed to be, nothing where it didn't. A woman stood at the glass looking out at the city below. She was the World Battlefield Association president. He'd seen photographs. What the photographs hadn't conveyed was the aura signature, which his scanner eyes placed immediately. Underworld origin, leadership tier, the same deep classification as the high priest but at a different register. Older, more settled, she turned from the glass and looked at him. She told him, without preamble, without the architecture of a conversation that builds toward a revelation, that she was the underworld queen. That the VR battlefield system, the global esports infrastructure that 11 years of commercial investment and international competition had built into the most watched athletic format on Earth, was not principally a sports enterprise. It was a training apparatus. Humanity needed to be able to fight at scale, at speed, with coordination structures that individual dungeon clearers had never needed because dungeons were isolated environments. The primordial light threat, the entity or force or process approaching Earth from whatever space the deepest dungeon levels had interfaced with, required a different kind of response than the dungeon era had. She had known this was coming. She had spent the years since the dungeon's closing building the infrastructure for humanity's next fight. She told him she had found him in the final dungeon in 2021, where the dungeon's last architecture had been holding him because the system didn't know how to close while someone was still inside it. She had opened the exit. She had returned him to Seoul. His collapse outside the memorial statue was not the end of his exhaustion. It was the end of the dungeon's hold. He sat with this for a moment. He asked her what the primordial light was. She said that was the question. She knew its signal. She knew its pattern from the underworld's oldest records, before the false voice had used it as a mask. She didn't know its form, its origin, or precisely how much time remained. He said he'd need to be ready. She said she knew. It was why she'd brought him home. The ancient emperor was dead, and had been for a very long time, which made him difficult to negotiate with and more difficult to defeat. He existed in a VR simulation, the Tomb of 10,000, a reconstruction of a dungeon level that had been sealed before the clearing era even began. The simulation was the High Priest's resource, built from underworld archival data, and the ancient emperor was rendered in it at full historical capability. An undead sovereign whose combat technique had developed across centuries of afterlife existence into something that bore almost no resemblance to current fighter profiles. The weapon spirit technique was what mattered, concentrating spiritual energy directly into a weapon's structure, bypassing the physical impact model and engaging the opponent's aura layer directly. Against entities with physical immortality or high-tier regeneration, the class of opponent the upcoming threat seemed likely to produce, standard physical combat had a ceiling. Weapon spirit manifestation didn't use the same ceiling. The Emperor wouldn't teach it. He would demonstrate it, repeatedly, by using it to end their duels, and from those demonstrations Yaop was supposed to derive the principle. The first week of attempts produced 17 losses and 1 draw that the Emperor ended before Yaop could convert it, which suggested the Emperor wasn't interested in making it easy. Yaop trained for a week between sessions. Not the combat mechanics, he'd mapped those in the first 3 duels. The principle was in the energy management, concentrating aura to a single focal point in the weapon rather than distributing it across the body for mobility and endurance. It was counterintuitive in a way that required practice to make automatic, because everything about sustained combat rewarded distribution. Concentration left you slow. It left you exposed. You had to trust that what the concentrated point would do when it hit was worth what it cost to get there. He ran the concentration exercise against his own equipment in the YSM facility late at night when the building was empty, the high priest watching from the doorway with the slightly distant expression of someone observing a process they'd seen attempted many times. She didn't offer corrections. He didn't ask for them. The principle either worked in the execution or it didn't. By the end of the week, the aura was sitting in the spear correctly. Not distributed, not borrowed from his mobility reserves, but concentrated, held, the energy dense and stable at the tip. He could feel the difference. The weapon was heavier in a way that had nothing to do with mass. He went back into the simulation. The Emperor came at him the same way he had 17 times before. Direct, ancient, with the unhurried certainty of something that had been winning for centuries. Yaop took the opening exchanges at a loss and let the Emperor build confidence in the pattern, because the pattern was real. His physical speed against the Emperor's technique was not dominant, and covering it up would have been optimism rather than strategy. He needed one opening, not a dominant position. One opening where the concentration could deploy. The Emperor made a move in the 4th exchange that left a window of approximately 2 seconds at his head axis, a commitment to a secondary attack that cleared the defensive coverage. It was the kind of window that appeared because the Emperor had won 17 duels against the same opponent and had begun to operate on the assumption that the same opponent's responses were predictable. Yaop drove the spear through that window. The weapon spirit made contact. The aura layer under the Emperor's physical form registered the hit before the physical simulation could process a block or a dodge, because the spirit manifestation bypassed the physical impact model the way the technique was designed to. The tip went through to the head position. The Emperor stopped. The simulation's rendering held the tableau for a moment. Yaop's spear extended, the Emperor's form at the point of contact, the chamber around them, and then the High Priest's voice came in from the observation frame, steady and quiet, confirming what the system's completion flag had already indicated. The duel was done. Yaop pulled the spear back and stood in the simulation space with his breathing settling into the post-combat rhythm it had learned over 2 decades of practice. He had the technique. Not perfectly. Perfection was the work of years. But he had it well enough to use, well enough to build from, well enough to bring to whatever the primordial light turned out to be when it stopped being a signal and became something with a form. The High Priest stepped into the simulation space and looked at him. She had the expression of someone acknowledging a thing she'd hoped for without being certain of. She said he was ready to begin. He looked at the simulation's rendered chamber around him, the old stone, the light from the dungeon sources, the Emperor's still form, and thought about everything that had come since the day he woke up in a hospital room with nothing and a nurse explaining the specific nature of his destitution. The world outside this chamber had arenas full of people watching esports they didn't know had been built to prepare them for a war. Somewhere above the Eiffel Tower was a Buer signal he'd mapped but not neutralized. The false voice was still out there, using the primordial light's frequency to move pieces around a board that humanity didn't know it was on. And there were people who needed what he could give them. Han with her recovered instincts, Yunbom with his shadow walk finally clean, Sonya with her real technique finally in her hands, Neon and Sung-Ho running a system nobody had thought to build before, Ji-Ho still standing after 4 weeks of training that should have ended him. All of it was connected. The club and the cosmic threat and the 17 years and the thing that was coming. He had spent his entire adult life being the last one left in a room that needed someone to stay. He was still here. He had work to do.